All right, so we are expecting a lot more people that will be joining, but I don't want to start too late so that we have time for all of our questions. So we'll get started. So thank you for joining us all this evening to discuss 15-minute neighborhoods, complete communities, and happy cities. I would like to recognize that most of us are attending this webinar and more generally living in the unceded and unsurrendered territories of the Algonquin Anishinaabe. And even one of our speakers, Houssam, is calling in from Vancouver on the lands of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh nations. So my personal interest for this subject of 15-minute neighborhoods, dense, complete communities, increased quite a bit when the city of Ottawa voted to expand the urban boundary just a few months ago in May. And although I am no urban planner at all, I recognize that the way that we're shaping our streets and building our homes is leading to the city's need for more land and pushing us further and further away from our climate change goals outlined in the city's declaration for a climate emergency. But there may be a way to reduce the city's impact. What if we were to build denser communities where we can reach all of the amenities we need within a 15-minute walk from our home? This solution to urban expansion and car-centric disconnected communities has gained some traction in many cities around the world. And I think we're at a pivotal moment in time where Ottawa can choose to plan our communities in more thoughtful, environmental, and connected ways. So joining us this evening are two individuals who can provide really interesting perspectives on the subject. Houssam is an operations manager and senior planner at Happy City, an urban planning and design consultancy that uses the science of well-being to create healthier and happier and more inclusive communities. Houssam is an urban activist from Cairo and Halifax, where he has founded and participated in a lot of grassroots movements, and I guess now in Vancouver as well. Jeff Leiper is the councillor of Kitchissippi Ward, which includes the Hinchinburg, Mechanicsville, and Westboro neighborhoods, which are arguably some of the areas in Ottawa that are closest to achieving the 15-minute neighborhood status. Before becoming councillor, Jeff served as the Vice President of Strategic Communications, Research and Policy at an NGO, the Information and Communications Technology Council, where he led policy development initiatives. So before I pass the mic to Houssam, that will have a few points to bring up, I do have some details on how this webinar will go. So you are all currently muted. So while the speakers are introducing the subject, please put any questions or comments into the chat box. And if they need to be addressed urgently, like we can't hear the speaker, that kind of thing, I can interrupt and let them know. And then I will have a few questions for both speakers afterwards, and we'll open up the floor to any of you attendees that have questions yourselves. You can either put them in the chat box if you prefer, or you can raise your hand, the function at the bottom of your screen. I will unmute you and you'll be able to ask the questions yourself. If you are Francophone and would like to ask your questions in French, I can translate for the speakers if they need. And lastly, I would like to point out that the webinar is being recorded. You probably heard it at the beginning because we will be sharing this on our YouTube channel and share it with the people that RSVP'd but couldn't make it this evening. So Houssam, off to you. I think you're going to share your screen. So whenever you're ready.
Thank you, Emily, and welcome everyone. I'm gonna try and share my screen now and hope that nothing goes wrong. Technology does not always go well with me. Okay. Now, Emily, can everyone see my screen?
Yes, I think so. I can. Yeah.
Okay. Well, thank you all for having me here, and thank you for inviting me to speak to you about this exciting new concept of the 15-minute city. This conversation is really timely because we are experiencing unprecedented times. I think, right now we're dealing with this once-in-a-lifetime pandemic that has endangered our health and our economy, but we're also trying to deal with it on top of existing crises and fragilities in our society that we've been dealing with before. Things like the affordability crisis, social isolation and loneliness crisis. Before the pandemic, we were and we're still facing a crisis of inequality and racism in our cities. But most glaringly, we are all facing together a climate crisis. this cancer that is threatening the survival of our planet. It's hard to grasp how all of these crises are connected to a simple concept of a 15-minute city, but it is. In the 15-minute city, no matter what neighborhood you live in, the concept states that you should be able to get to most of your needs within a 15-minute walk or roll or bike ride, and that should you need to leave your neighborhood for longer trips, then you should be able to do so and have the option of an affordable, comfortable, and convenient transit ride. The 15-minute city should provide people with the dignity of a home and make space in our communities for the voices of all people and allow our cities and our communities to be shaped by the voices of all people. In truth, it's not really that new of a concept. It's really the repackaging or the rebranding of two old concepts, the walkable communities and the transit-oriented development communities. But that doesn't make it any less exciting, because the good news is these concepts are some of the most heavily researched concepts in urban planning. They have been investigated from various different perspectives and interdisciplinary approaches. For example, they have been inspected from the lens of public health. And research is finding that if you compare two communities, one of which is your typical car-dependent suburb, and other is on the right is your typical more walkable community where you can get to more things within a 10 to 15-minute walk, that people who live in walkable communities tend to walk up to 5 times more per week than those who live in car-dependent communities. That people who live in walkable communities tend to be lighter, they are less likely to suffer from obesity. They tend to live 3 to 5 years longer than those who live in car-dependent communities. And with all the effects of physical inactivity, they are less likely to suffer from cancer, from heart disease, stroke, diabetes, kidney disease. It's kind of marvelous how public health officials have been amping up how much they're recommending healthy neighborhoods as a solution to our public health problems. When researchers looked at it from a social well-being and a social sciences perspective, they found even more incredible things. They found that neighborhoods that are walkable are more likely to have stronger and more stable social relationships. They're more likely to have trust between neighbors, and they're people who live in car-dependent communities are more likely to be spending less time with their children, to having less family dinners as a factor of the byproduct of car dependency, which is long commutes, which leaves their children and their communities more vulnerable to issues of addiction, violence, and crime. But also we're seeing differences in the relationships that people have with their communities, that walkable communities tend to have higher rates of place attachment. That means more people say that they feel connected to the place that they live in, which has a lot of beneficial outcomes that occur as byproducts to that. And people have investigated from the lens of equity, and they found out huge connections between the issues of inequality and car dependency and transit access. They're finding, for example, that walkable communities, the ability to walk to services is one of the strongest predictors of health and economic and social outcomes for children. They're finding that the byproduct of car dependency, which is commuting time, is the single greatest predictor of a child's ability to climb the economic ladder, more than crime rates, more than test scores. And we're seeing this in different ways. We know today that there's a disproportionate number of people who more likely to be people of color, people with disabilities, people on low income, who are trapped in car-dependent communities with poor access to transit. They're forced to experience long commutes, forced to buy cars that they cannot afford in order to get access to jobs and to essential services that they need. And they get trapped in the cycle that they can never get out of. It's also been investigated from the lens of resilience, and we're seeing that walkable communities are greener, they are more sustainable. not just in the way that people move, but also in the types of buildings that tend to exist in walkable communities. We are seeing that they are more economically productive. Walkable communities tend to be more productive per acre than car-dependent communities. We're seeing that they're more resilient to economic shocks, to natural disasters, even despite a lot of popular beliefs and a lot of kind of instinctive reactions. This initial research that's coming out of the pandemic is showing that, for example, in New York, it wasn't the dense Manhattan neighborhoods that fueled the spread of the coronavirus. It was actually the more car-dependent centers, because these communities, all the people who live there had to congregate in the big box stores and the massive grocery stores to get the services they need in these indoor environments where the virus spreads so easily. And we're seeing changes in preferences, and even when we're talking about economic resilience, we're seeing that walkers are more likely to spend more in the local economy and local shops than people who are driving. That's why a lot of main streets, etc., are trying to attract this revitalization and understanding that, you know, making places better for people is not just to create joyous spaces, but it is also has an economic return. We're seeing changes in preferences towards people wanting to live. Surveys are showing that more people prefer to live in walkable communities than car-dependent ones, prefer to shop in walkable communities and main streets than in big box stores. And we're seeing that result as a byproduct that walkable communities are becoming more valuable. They're attracting more value, which is an indication of the level of demand for these communities. But on the other hand, is also creating some problems by overpricing these communities for the people who want to live there. What does this all tell us? What happens when we reach the same conclusion from multiple different perspectives? It makes me wonder, at what point do we have to stop saying that, you know, it's nice, that it's good to have walkable communities or 15-minute communities, and instead to start to really recognize how essential it is to have walkable communities, how they are foundational to allowing us to access all of the opportunities that our cities have to offer. And it makes me wonder whether, you know, as a planner, what is my ethical responsibility to deliver walkable communities and to make sure that more people are able to access living in these communities. I know a lot of planners, a lot of city builders know this, but the question begs to it, what are we building? Are we building walkable communities? And when we look at what we're actually doing, it is not quite as we want it to be. The most recent survey I found, most recent study I found showed that of the new communities built in Canada, nearly 73% are car dependent. 73%. How is this happening? This is a ridiculous. As primarily works in business operations and planning and transit planning, I tend to think in systems, and 73% is a consistently bad outcome. It tells you that there is something inherently broken, not just in our awareness and our education of how we are approaching city building, but in that particular processes and policies that we're taking to build them. If you have a factory that is consistently churning out 73% of the time faulty products, raising the awareness and our sense of shared responsibility is not necessarily going to solve that. I apologize, I have a dog and he's barking. This is the approach that we've been taking to walkable communities and trying to build walkable communities. Is we are trying to encourage a sense of shared responsibility, a sense of shared responsibility, and a sense of education and awareness. But if you have a fact that's coming out, I'm sorry. Then what we need to do is to Sorry, everyone. I apologize for the delay and the interruption. As I was saying, if we have a factory that's consistently producing faulty products, awareness and education is not enough. We have to look at the processes. We have to understand what's wrong with our production line, what's wrong with our training programs, revamp our processes, and understand who is responsible for what. Education changes consciousness, and it's really important. But the system does not change without concrete changes in policy and process, and without making it clear who is exactly responsible for what. And that's what I hope that we can focus on as we transition this conversation from, is it nice to have 15-minute neighborhoods, to how do we make sure they happen? And what are the, like, it makes me want to talk about what are the essential components of walkable neighborhoods. And when we look at a walkable community, we have to first understand, what do we need to do to make sure that communities are walkable? What do we need to provide? And research gives us some insight into how we can make that happen. For example, the researchers have identified, and all the different papers have collected into what some researchers are calling the 5 Ds. The first is diverse destinations. To encourage people to walk, you need to get them places to walk to. They need to be able to fulfill the vast needs that people have. And the rough rule of thumb is that 80% of people's daily needs should be within a 10 to 15-minute walk. And the other is that we need to think about destination access. It's not just that the destinations are there, but we need safe pedestrian spaces, sidewalks, and or bike lanes that are within close proximity for people to actually be able to access these services safely and to have a comfortable walking experience. And that rolls into design. It's not just enough to have something within proximity. We also need to think about the experience itself. Research is showing that people are more likely to walk further in environments that are safe, that are sheltered from fast-moving traffic, and that are convivial, like they have trees and variety in how people, what people see on the edges of the building, as opposed to giant parking lots, or walking next to highways, or walking in environments where all things have big blank facades that don't give you any reason to enjoy your walk. But we also need to think about density. And this is a really important piece of the puzzle. Research is showing that a minimum density of 35 people and jobs per hectare is necessary to ensure that there is enough customers and destinations to support all the businesses that are there. But it also ensures that there are enough people who get to have access to these communities. This is a really kind of crucial and essential aspect of what we're talking about. We do have walkable communities, but in so many cases, we've put this artificial cap on the number of people who can have the privilege of living there. And when we think about the role of walkable communities in all aspects of our lives, we need to start rethinking of walkable communities as an amenity, and rethink that approach to think of walkable communities as a human right that everyone deserves to have the access to. And the last piece of the puzzle that is no less important than all of these is the distance to transit. Not everyone can work in the same neighborhood that they live in. And for many other reasons, people are going to need to make trips outside of their neighborhoods to other neighborhoods and centers. And if they don't have access to affordable, frequent, and reliable transit within a short walk, then they're going to drive. And as soon as they make that choice, they compromise all of the other Ds, and they compromise it for their own communities and for every community that they drive to and drive through. All these pieces work together, but they're also quite distinct from each other. They are structural enough that each can be achieved on their own, but they are independent in the sense that they need to work together to actually provide any value. When you think of a hospital, you're trying to build a hospital has to provide health. And it's just as important that you get the foundation, the pillars, the windows, and the actual exterior of the building that gives you a hospital that allows you to provide health. But they are also independent in the same way that a really great plane engine is kind of worthless without two functional wings. So we really have to ask ourselves, which of these aspects are being delivered in our communities now? Who is responsible for delivering them? We need to think of the responsibilities that fall under the different levels of government, whether federal, provincial, or local, under professionals like planners, engineers, and architects, and even the private sector that has a big role to play in making these decisions. And here in Ottawa, you are pushing, and this is a new initiative that's coming in Ottawa for the 15-minute neighborhood. But my question is, how are you going to make sure that it gets implemented and is not compromised? How will your city building process and system change to ensure that we get consistently good outcomes? How will you track your performance? How will you communicate these facts? And how are you going to ensure that everyone gets to have access to walkable communities? I think right now we are at a pivotal moment in the history of city building. Feels like we've been asleep for the past century, building communities that have been killing us, have been destroying our environment, and have been, in many cases, making us miserable. But it makes me wonder whether this pandemic and all the events that are happening this year are going to be enough of a wake-up call. If all the suffering that is being experienced by various people around the world actually going to force us to look into ourselves and change and not just to do things differently? Or is it going to be more of the same? I think that the time to act on this is now. Actually, it's probably years ago, but we'll settle for now. But this change is possible. It can be done. And I think it will be done sooner or later. I believe that. And I think that when it is, our cities will transform for the better. I think that they will become places for everyone to be able to thrive and to live with dignity. And I think that we will look back in horror at the way that we are currently building cities. And that those of us who are part of this wave of change will be remembered for it. So whether you're a politician or an advocate or a professional or a developer or even just a concerned citizen, I think we all have a role to play and a responsibility to uphold. Thank you.
Thank you, Houssam. That was really great to hear your perspective that was both based on science, but also your opinion, and you seem very passionate. So it was really great to hear. I'll definitely have to listen to your presentations a couple times. I took some screenshots, but I'll have to go back and listen again. Jeff, I'm sure you have some comments.
What can I say? What an inspiring presentation. Walkable communities as a human right is, I think you've just given me my next campaign slogan. That is absolutely awesome. For those, I'm going to guess that most of the people who are participating in this webinar are from Ottawa, and I'm speaking today from half a block or so away from the corner of Parkdale and Wellington. And I am fortunate to live in what I think is one of Ottawa's most walkable communities. And one of the things that I really want to work on is making sure that everybody in Ottawa has the opportunity to live in similar communities. As Houssam was talking, I thought about the fact that about a year and a half or so ago, I had a heart attack due entirely to my own poor living. And, I was able to walk to my cardiac rehab because the Civic Hospital, or the Heart Institute, is so close to my house. And I mean, that's an amazing community to live in, where healthcare and getting to it is walkable and bikeable. And Houssam obviously has also raised the big question on everybody's minds right now, which is, what is the pandemic going to do to city planning? And it's interesting because we are having this official plan discussion, and one of the keys discussions that we're having is 15-minute communities. But as the pandemic has gone on, one of the reactions from many people in Ottawa has been to suggest that maybe the city needs to slow down on intensification and be more tolerant of sprawl, because people want to live in larger homes that have home offices. There is going to be more working from home. And I think, my caution to people is that is a very, very privileged view. The housing prices for the kinds of homes in which people can have a home office and that much kind of space are well out of reach of most people in Ottawa. I've got a team in my office, and several of my team are living in apartments. And they're never going to be able to afford, or not while they're working for me, unfortunately, a really large home on the edge of the city that has room for a home office. What I need to do is to make sure that here in the neighborhood where they live, that they have the outdoor amenity spaces, that there are the zoning in place to allow for work hubs, that they can work flexibly from home and from an office with great transit in between. I think we have to double down on 15-minute communities as the pandemic goes. I live here in Hintonburg, and I've lived in this neighborhood through, I guess it was the ice storm. Was it 2003 when we had the Great Eastern Blackout, the 48-hour blackout as a result of the tornadoes a few years ago, now the pandemic? There is no other community in which I want to live, because I'm able, as city councillor and as a resident, to get on the street and have access to all the services, all the agencies, all my neighbors right on the street, and I don't have to drive. But we do have that opportunity today through our new official planning to make steps to try to make sure that we are committed to 15-minute neighborhoods. A couple of the challenges to 15-minute neighborhoods, they do require density. And the level of density that's required in order to support a neighborhood in which all of the services that you want to access day to day are close by, it's density that we haven't necessarily seen over the course of the last 60 years outside of some core neighborhoods like Hintonburg and Westboro. Today we had a discussion at our planning committee about a six-story building. I can't remember where, that neighbors were very upset about because it's against the character of their single-family homes. Those single-family homes are the result of, and Houssam as a planner can correct me on my timeline, but 60 years, 70 years of planning that has been enabled by transportation technology that allowed us to very much separate the uses to which land is put. So great big swaths of land are set aside for residential, and because people can use private vehicles to get to it, a much larger, an entirely separate part of land is able to be zoned for commercial, and an entirely separate portion of land is able to be done as industrial. And that kind of planning thinking is beginning to break down, but we do need to be more aggressive about it. And we also see that kind of planning thinking has seeped into our thinking about the residential zones. We are taking a very serious look over the course of the next 3 years at the degree to which the city can be sustainable when we have giant swaths of our land reserved for single family homes or just semi-detached. Getting those low-rise apartment buildings zoned in every neighborhood in Ottawa is going to be a critical part of creating the density we need in order to have 15-minute neighborhoods. The other piece of it, of course, is transportation. And to Houssam's point, not everybody is going to be able to live within 15 minutes of where they work. We are going to need to be able to commute. And one of the things that density provides us with is the ability to support transit. The density that is required in order to do that is fairly significant. So what you've seen is that the city around its transit stations has begun to put much more aggressive zoning, a much more aggressive density around its transit stations. And unfortunately, it's much more aggressive than residents are used to, and it poses a political challenge to try to overcome that. But I think it is absolutely critical. One of the things that I think Houssam only touched on it briefly is the operational decisions as well. And certainly I appreciated his discussion about the design of transportation infrastructure, design of bike lanes. One of the things that is always on every Ottawa politician's mind is winter. And the plowing of our city streets, the plowing of our sidewalks, the plowing of our bike lanes is a major discussion that has ramifications across our transportation planning, across our zoning. We are not going to be successful and sustainable as a city if we are unable to put the resources that are necessary in to ensure that a walkable community is walkable for all 12 months of the year. I tell the story a lot about my my partner, who is a driver, and she a couple of years ago determined, you know what, I'm Jeff Leiper's partner, I should really try to walk the walk, and she went to walk to a local one of our local grocery stores, and she didn't get halfway down the block before she tripped on the ice, fell, bruised up, you know, the whole side of her body, and determined that, you know, the safest way to get 4 blocks to the Herb and Spice is to drive. That is, you know, all of the great planning thinking that the city is doing, that our consultants are doing, that advocacy groups like Ecology Ottawa are doing, all of it will be sabotaged if we don't take care of some of those day-to-day details and put the resources that are necessary in to support mixed use zoning, to support density, to support the building of transportation infrastructure, active transportation infrastructure. All of those great investments will be pointless if we don't keep our sidewalks clean. And you know, this is one of the less sexy but probably most important things your city councillor should be pushing for. Emily, I know there's a ton of questions that are coming. I see that in the chat, the little bubble keeps coming up with lots of discussion. Houssam is the star of the show, so I don't want to go on for too much longer, but I really appreciate Ecology Ottawa's opportunity, invitation to participate in this, and I'm looking forward to hearing more from Houssam because his vision is absolutely inspirational.
Thank you, Jeff, for your comments. It has definitely tied it all into the Ottawa context very well. I do see the chat box firing up. I do have a few questions that I'll ask the both of you, so you can, either one of you can go first and answer as you wish, and then whatever has come up in the chat box that hasn't been discussed, I can jump to that afterwards. So first question, the ideal is a world where intensification means increases in social infrastructure, green infrastructure, transit infrastructure. But what are the mechanisms to ensure that this infrastructure and these co-benefits do actually come from intensification? I think we've seen some examples where it's just very dense and these infrastructures aren't present. Do you both have any comments on that?
I think it's a little bit repeating some of what I said. Is intensification, and I'm understanding this is just increasing density, is one piece of the puzzle. In density alone, without a proper pedestrian network and a bike network, without destinations within walking distance, without access to transit, without all of these pieces that I laid out, doesn't work and can cause harm. And this is why part of this trying to rethink about the 5 Ds of walkable communities is to understand their interdependency, because there is very valid concern from people who are afraid of density, because in certain cases, in certain past examples, when density came in without all of the other pieces, it caused harm, and it probably did. And the reason is not because density is bad, but because it can't do the intended effect without the others. They have to move together, or else the building falls. It's like, or the airplane goes down. And that's the experience that people are having. And we need, I think part of this is showing the compassion to understand why people are feeling certain things, and understanding that the problem needs a more systemic and coordinated approach that makes it very clear how we can deliver all aspects of walkability together.
Emily, I'll address that from the city and mechanism perspective. Intensification does generate revenues that pay for soft and hard infrastructure, and it's long cycles. But the gist of it for those participating in today's webinar is that the official plan creates a vision for how the city should develop, and we're in the middle right now of creating our official plan that will describe where density is going to go, and what mixed use zoning should look like, etc. And those get translated into various different plans, like the transportation master plan, the infrastructure plan, the cycling master plan. Those plans are created to support the vision that's outlined in the official plan. And the most important part of the master plans, as we call them, is the list of projects that you have to, the spending that you need to do in order to support growth. That's fundamentally what the city's official plan is, certainly in Ontario. Those lists have a price tag. And at the end of the day, we create development charges, or we have development charges that developers pay. It gets passed on to new homeowners that offset the costs of doing those projects. I think what residents, particularly in the downtown areas, might not be seeing is that the cycles are long, and there is a gap right now between the generation of the development charges and being able to pay for the projects that are in the list. Over time, the spending on hard and soft infrastructure will catch up to the intensification, but it does take time. The mechanisms are in place, and every 5 years or so, I hope that residents pay attention to the creation of the master plans, particularly the lists of projects that come out of those that need to be paid for, and then pay attention to the development charges bylaw, which is how we pay for those projects that are in those lists. I like Houssam's answer better, but I did want to provide some indication of what the mechanisms are.
No, that's great. Thank you both for your perspectives. I think it shows, how we get into it, what are the details, and how complex it is to actually implement. And it's not as easy as just, clicking your fingers, tapping your fingers, or however you say, and making it happen. So worries of gentrification and increased prices on housing and rental markets have been multiplying. How have Ottawa and other cities across Canada been juggling with this need for redesigning and rebuilding neighborhoods on the one end and affordability on the other? I know you've both touched on this, but are there examples of cities that have done very well, or what can we learn from other cities?
Obviously, the housing affordability issue is one that is complex, but also fundamentally simple. Prices go up when demand exceeds supply. And we are seeing right now a lot of pent-up demand for people wanting to live in walkable communities, in communities that have access to all the amenities that they want and close proximity to work. But we're also seeing is that the vast majority of communities in our cities, especially in Canada, do not fulfill this criteria. And so what you have is a lot of demand for walkable communities, and only a few communities, usually the ones that have been built with the streetcar neighborhoods, that actually fulfill this. And whenever this demand is like, whenever you try to kind of increase the cap a little bit, just in the small number of communities here in Vancouver, nearly 70% of the land covered in Vancouver is zoned for single family use. There are neighborhoods that you can't add more density in. So when you try to look at a big pent up demand and you're trying to funnel it by making spot changes in one small community or one community at a time, you get the influx of this regional demand manifesting in one community. And you get huge changes and huge backlash from neighbors who, after one experience, tend to fight tooth and nail for what they want afterwards. And we have this crazy broken system, an engagement system, where people there's so much polarization when any project is happening. But then you look at other cities that have taken a different approach, that have looked and said, well, what's the kind of minimum density that we know is not going to cause harm in communities, and trying to allow it in much more areas of land to unlock the capacity of land to absorb more people. You look at Minneapolis, that are now by default pretty much allowing fourplexes everywhere in the city, and allowing apartment buildings anywhere within walking distance of their transit network. I think other cities like Portland have just announced a similar project. And this kind of thinking of increasing and allowing more people to live in communities that are now artificially capped, but doing it as kind of a blanket approach, is the kind of thing that will help you alleviate some of the dangers of intensification. It doesn't just pop up in one community.
I think I won't run over all of that ground, all of which I absolutely agree with. Density is a key part of addressing housing affordability, and it does have to be across the city. What a number of us are going to be watching for is in Ottawa right now, we are 2 weeks away or so from passing rules that in the 5 urban wards would significantly increase the amount of density that's allowed in our R4 zones. So those are the zones that are intended to have things like low-rise apartment buildings, but where the zoning actually prevents low-rise apartment buildings from being built. In the discussion about the urban boundary, while a number of us lost that, we tried to hold the line on the urban boundary. The urban boundary will be expanded, but we're going to, in order to have room for the 400,000 people who we expect to move into the city by 2046, we recognize that we're going to have much, much greater intensity right across the city. And the commitment that we have from city staff is to do a comprehensive zoning bylaw that will look at all those other zones before, besides the R4, which is where intensification is starting from. We are cynical. Houssam talked about the fact that, a lot of the intensification efforts are being focused on the pre-war neighborhoods, the streetcar neighborhoods. We can talk as a council a good game about intensifying outside of those pre-war neighborhoods, but the proof will be in the pudding. There are huge swaths of this city that are close to transit and that are reserved for single-family homes. And every week now we are seeing every 2 weeks we're seeing the applications in the suburbs for things like low-rise apartment buildings that we absolutely need in order to address the absolutely brutal 1.8% vacancy rate that we have in the city that is such a barrier to affordability for so many people. To its credit, council has been approving these, but the proof of our commitment will be in whether or not the comprehensive zoning bylaw that emerges from our new official plan, our new growth management strategy, actually results in equitably distributed, sensibly distributed density throughout the city.
Yeah, I think that brings me to my question of how are we going to preserve the character of the existing neighborhoods? There are some that already, like R4 zones, that can cater quite well to more intensification. But I think a lot of people are concerned about the loss of trees, of green spaces, the degradation of neighborhood characters, increase in traffic, and increase in infrastructure. Is there a way to juggle all of those different different needs of different communities? Is it a citywide effort, or is it, you know, cater to every single neighborhood of the city?
I think the concern here is that communities should be reflective of the preferences and the needs of the people that live within them. And we all know the harm that planning has done, that the planning profession and city building has done when they've tried to overpower the will of the community. But it's not black or white. It doesn't have to be either or. You can build an art gallery, for example, or a library, as they have done in Halifax, that reflects the needs of the community, but one that also stands up and has fire exits. This is the difference in thinking between what is foundational and what is tailored to the preferences of the community. And we cannot allow a building to fall down because people have said, we don't want any columns in our building. So this is really the conversation of the trade-offs of understanding what is foundational, what is concerned with the success of our entire region, and the ability for more people to be able to access communities and be able to enjoy communities, and what is really essential so that people feel like they are connected to their neighborhoods, like they have a say in their neighborhoods, and that they are able to tailor their neighborhoods to ways that represent them. That's the kinds of conversations that you need to be very clear on and understand what outcomes can be generated from both sides.
There are a lot of different ways of defining what the character of the neighborhood is. And if the character of the neighborhood is to have relatively small homes on large lots and not very much density, you know what? It's going to be really difficult to build a sustainable city. With density, though, there are ways. And the study that we're doing of Westboro infill is going to propose a number of ways of trying to build in ways that keep the streets walkable, such that the buildings that are going in are not antagonistic to pedestrians, where trees are still able to be planted. The big thing that gives, one of the reasons why density is difficult to achieve is our reliance or our expectation of parking. A lot of land is given over in our city and in cities across North America to parking. It's not going to be easy to achieve, but if we can turn surface area over to something other than parking, then we start to see, you know, space in low-rise apartment buildings where you can store bikes in shelters. You can have trees and gardens and green space in areas that were previously paved. But it is tricky to do that because you also have to have the transit and the transportation infrastructure that is attractive to use compared to the private vehicle. And it's going to be a very tricky balancing act. What I am seeing in the review of our R4 rules and what I'm seeing in the review of Westboro infill is that, you know, the thing that gives is surface parking. And if we can reduce our reliance on that, we actually wind up with the space to do things on these lots that allow building forms that are what people actually like. I tend to find it's not necessarily, you know, the character of the neighborhood at the end of the day, people may or may not define it according to what the density of their neighborhood is. And if the density of their neighborhood is how they define their neighborhood, I'm going to have a difficult time sort of preserving the character of their neighborhood. But if it's walkable streets, and if it's trees, and if it is attractive architecture, that's something that we can realistically achieve. The give is on surface parking. I want to emphasize as well the importance here of density and climate change. There is some tree loss involved with intensification. I think we can do a better job of replacing trees, but the statistic that, you know, our foresters have passed on to me is that, you know, for every car in Canada that is driven, the average number of kilometers that a car in Canada is driven, it's 500 trees. And if that's the number of trees it takes to offset the emissions from that car. The loss of one tree, if it means that a person is able to live in a 15-minute walkable neighborhood and take much more advantage of active transportation and public transit, is I think you have to view it against that much bigger 500 to 1 car problem that we have when urban sprawl is allowed to be sustained.
Yeah, I think you're touching on something really important, Jeff, is the role that transportation has to play in all of this. A lot of the concerns that come with intensification, that comes with you know, adding services and everything within walking distance, are related to people's over reliance on cars, and to the fact that driving is the only option in many cases. And if you look at the patterns of cities all across history, cities have been shaped by the way we move. Our mobility plays a huge role. And in often cases, rethinking how transit plays a role in development, the role that it has in leading the way of communities, not just coming later as a service, is an action and just a kind of a conversation that needs to be opened up, because it's essential. It's essential to this whole piece.
William just brought up a great point in the chat there. He asked, what kind of steps can ordinary citizens take to actually advance 15-minute neighborhoods? Maybe Jeff and Houssam, you can suggest ways for a variety of commitment levels. If you have 5 minutes a week, if you have 3 hours a week, if you have 20 hours a week to commit to changing the planning of your city, what would you suggest to the listeners right now? What steps can they take?
I know Hussam's answer is going to be much more inspirational than mine, so I'll give the politician point of view here. You know, a lot of this depends on council will. Learning about great planning is the first step, and doing the reading, talking to the experts, talking to your politicians is a great first step. Electing politicians who are committed to it is actually a fairly time and resource intensive contribution that you can make to your city. It sounds like I'm asking for campaign donations, and I'm not allowed to. But you know, it is important. We have a by-election in Cumberland right now, and if you are committed to 15-minute neighborhoods, one of the most important contributions you can make is to make sure that a candidate is elected in that ward who is committed to 15-minute neighborhoods. And then the advocacy groups like Ecology Ottawa and advocacy groups like community associations are a critical contribution that you can make. Going to the planning committee of your local community association once a month for 2 or 3 hours is a huge contribution that you can make to the planning of your city. You need to learn what the mechanisms are, how is planning done in your city, because it is going to be different from, you know, cities from Winnipeg or Manitoba to Ontario. There are all different mechanisms, but learning about planning takes place a lot through the institutional memory of community associations, and participating in those boring planning committee meetings and bringing the perspective as an advocate of the 15-minute community, when sometimes community associations can be less keen on change. And I see Roland looking at me, and I'm sure he'll recognize, you know, it's important to have a diversity of views during those 3-hour planning committee meetings that your community association has. Work with advocacy groups like Ecology Ottawa, work with your community associations, and during elections, get heavily involved.
Yeah, these are excellent points, Jeff. I mean, we're talking about policies, about processes, about kind of setting the limits to hold people responsible and accountable. And a lot of that has to come from the decision makers. And choosing your decision makers who will support that is a really important step to it. And I think, you know, I think of community organizations that they do play an important role. But if you look at community organizations today, participating in them requires that you have time and money that not everyone has. So it tends to skew. We know in North America specifically, it tends to skew to populations that are not representative of the communities that they supposedly represent. And it doesn't mean that these voices don't need to be heard, but it means we need to ask, how can the other voices be heard through the community organizations? And it's not just enough to open the door and say everyone is welcome. In San Francisco, who have done amazing recovery plans in their transportation system, they're making changes that they've never done before. And one of the situations, they try to make changes in a community called Tenderloin, which is has a lot of low-income people, a lot of people of color, people with disabilities, and seniors. They tried to roll out their normal plans and their normal tools, and then they realized they weren't working. And so they worked with these community organizations. And one of them I found really interesting. It's called the Tenderloin Community Benefit District. It has a structure and a funding model that's really similar to business improvement districts, where people have to vote and kind of gather together for a board. And then it's actually funded in part by property taxes and other service costs, so that people who are working and giving their time are actually paid to do it. And when you open that opportunity, when you recognize that having an organized voice to speak on behalf of a community is something that is worth compensating, something of value, you invite a lot of people who would not be able to contribute it on their own time. That's just one example.
Yeah, a lot of the people who are participating this evening have skills, time, and capacity to do things that there are a lot of people in the city don't have the privilege or the capacity to do. And I think working with civil society, you know, being involved with the City for All Women initiative, who are working to make sure that more vulnerable communities are able to participate in planning processes, working with groups like Acorn. That can be an important part of it as well, because oftentimes the interests of people who best benefit from 15-minute neighborhoods are the most vulnerable in our city. And capacity building in those communities is a great way to ensure that their voice is heard. You know, I host an open house about a controversial development in Kitchissippi twice a month, and I have been for 6 years now. And you know, the folks who I'm looking at in the crowd are homeowners, and they are well off and among the most privileged in our city. And very rarely do I see the people who can't afford to live in our 15-minute community but would like to. And their ability to participate in that open house that I'm holding at 7 o'clock on a weeknight is limited. And working with those communities to build capacity so that they can participate on the same level as the people who are already here is something that, you know, I would like to see a lot more of, and I struggle with the resources that I have. But it would be wonderful if we could have those dialogues during those controversial development meetings between people who want to live in our neighborhood and can't, and the people who are already here, and develop some empathy between those groups, and start to move along the spectrum of acceptance of the need for change in order to ensure a sustainable city.
Thank you both for these great ideas, these great comments, many of which are very interesting to me as a community organizer at Ecology Ottawa. It's great to hear these thoughts. I am aware of the time. We're 3 minutes over. So thank you all for attending, and a special thank you to Jeff and Houssam for this great conversation. It's been really great to have you both this evening take your time for this event. I would like to address, someone made a comment in the chat box. Christina said, is there anything that Ecology Ottawa can help coordinate? That was the point I was going to close on. Ecology Ottawa will be in touch soon. We do have plans to launch a 15-minute neighborhood campaign. You will be receiving news of that by email and on social media in the next few weeks. So stay tuned for email updates, and we will be in touch soon. There's tons of questions in the chat box that we didn't have time to address. So I'm sure Houssam and Jeff, you won't mind if people that are attending contact you by email directly to address these concerns or questions that they may have. So yeah, thank you again, everyone, for joining this evening. I appreciate your time, and it was really a great conversation. Have a great night.
Thank you very much, Emily. Houssam, thank you very much. It was a pleasure to meet you. Thanks, everyone who participated.
Thank you so much, everyone. Thanks for your time, and thanks for engaging.